Justice isn't just about the law. It's about the people who fight for it. I'm Jennifer Long, CEO of Equitas, where justice isn't a concept, it's a commitment. And this is Just Champions. This season, we're doing something new. We're looking at the ways sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking crimes are portrayed in film, TV, and documentaries. Together with my guests, we'll explore how we'd approach these cases if they landed on our desks today, the strategies we'd use, what the law says now, and how we'd support victims in and out of the courtroom to set up the best possible outcomes. Because the law isn't just theory. It's the foundation of real lives, real cases, and real change. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Just Champions. This week, we are talking about the Netflix series You. And this is a hit series that focuses on behaviors that in episode 1 quickly move from maybe a potential romantic curiosity to behaviors that certainly set off my alarms and should have set off the alarm bells of everyone watching. Although, sadly, in watching the series, I'm reminded of how often they're dismissed and minimized. And we're talking about stalking. And today we're going to talk about what happens when these individual initial acts snowball into stalking behaviors, when they become major red flags, and how prosecutors and law enforcement and others in the system intervene before the harm continues. And to do this today, I'm so excited because I'm joined by Assistant State Attorney Kristina Mills. And I love speaking with her. She has so much experience, spent years prosecuting cases of stalking, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, other forms of interpersonal violence. She is currently an intimate partner violence specialist with the Domestic Violence Unit at the Broward State Attorney's Office. And she's also president of the National Black Prosecutors Association. Her full bio will be in the show notes. And so you can read all about her. But Kristina, I am so glad you're here today.
I'm excited to be here too. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, of course. And I mean, I think your perspective on how we recognize, charge, and prosecute cases that are so often dismissed as lesser offenses is exactly what we need today. And so I want to start, I guess, with the big picture. Because in you, we see these behaviors in full picture, the stalking, the surveillance. I mean, and even in episode 1, it is the audience can see how these things quickly explode into a surveillance of, I guess, the characters, Joe character, this bookshop manager, and Beck, the object of his focus. And I am just wondering, in your experience, how these behaviors that for so often were just brushed off as creepy but not criminal, how prosecutors and you specifically learn to identify these red flags in cases.
So one of the unique things about the show You, and especially like episode 1, it's actually kind of perfect, which is probably why you chose it, as a case study for this topic, because Joe, our subject, our stalker, the whole show is from his perspective. And so you get to hear his thoughts. And that's not something that we get to see or hear, in abusers or in the people who, whether it be a friendship or relationship, that becomes our stalker, right? So we get to analyze it from all of his thoughts as well, right? And as I was trying to sit down and like identify and articulate, like, okay, what are some of the signs to watch for? Like, I want to start off by acknowledging that, like, you will not be able to see some of these signs and symptoms in the beginning, right? And no one goes up and approaches someone and says, oh my gosh, this person is so creepy. And I think that, they're probably going to like be upset with me. And that's who I should engage with. That's not how we operate, The red flags are going to look like green flags in the beginning, right? But like overachiever green flags, like they're too green. They're too green.
I love this. Tell me talk to me about this.
And so, as I started to kind of like identify, like, okay, how do you describe the behaviors? Because as we talked about in preparation, I think that when you're talking about stalking, and like who's going to become a stalker, right? Who has the potential to stalk you after, a relationship or has ended or time has passed, you're really looking for the person who was obsessed with you versus the person who was in love with you and loved you, right? Because if you love someone, you will let them go, right? Like that's the saying. And if it's meant for you, it will come back. But you don't pursue it endlessly and demand and assume or assign that person as your possession, as your trophy, as yours, as an object, or a subject. And so some of the red green flags will look like, I called it Mr. Me Too, and so it's like, oh my gosh, you love this, so do I. That's my favorite band too. Oh yes, I've done. And so everything. And I get it. It's like, oh, well, how do I know the difference between someone who I do just have things in common with and, you know, you're looking for someone that has like no personality, and you're not looking for someone, you're just being mindful, right? Of like someone that has no personality essentially outside of the things that you all have in common and that you like, right? Like, what is their personality? What do they like differently? What does their day-to-day look like? What is their history? What is their perspective on things, but when you have someone that is like so over eager to like always be over available or overextend themselves, but they're rarely expressing their wants and desires because all they want to do is make you happy, right? Like that's where, you're starting to fall into certain, dangerous behaviors, it's like the idolization and like them making you a trophy in some ways. Like this is what they want for you. And you hear Joe say, I wrote down a quote, he said, they need people like us to protect them, right? Because he knows best for her, right?
Yeah, it's so funny because I'm listening to you talk about how he is putting her up on a pedestal. And yet, again, the beautiful thing of being able to see this from his point of view is he blames her for everything, to include normal interactions in a store. I mean, using your credit card versus cash becomes your invitation to produce your name for this individual to then follow up and do surveillance on you. I mean, was that how you reacted to that scene or?
100%. It's like, yeah, that's exactly why. That's exactly why. Yes, I do own enough cash. Do I carry it? No. Do I want to spend it? No. I keep that 120 for emergencies and I've had the same one in there for 5 years, So
Right.
it's not about that. I'm like, I want my points.
Right. And it's like, I think of, okay, so you're the prosecutor. Again, understanding that this is 5 series, I think, going across. And just so you know, Kristina, I purposely only watched the first episode right now, although I intend to watch the whole thing because I wanted to come at it from, okay, I'm a prosecutor and I'm going to take a little artistic license here and pretend that Beck, after the first episode, is aware that she is being followed by Joe in some way. She has at least gotten a sense that he's tracking her. And so what would I do if I got a report from this victim? And it's like, we know all the things that he has done to be able to show up where she has been. But she doesn't even know all the places he's been. As the prosecutor, when you get a report, first of all, what are these types of reports looking like when a stalking victim is coming to you and making a report that they feel like they're being followed?
Okay, that is such an important question, the last way you phrased it, right? What do the reports look like versus what should we be looking for? Because those are night and day, like almost all the time. And it's not like because of poor police work or anything of that sort. It's because our victims are not professional victims and they're not lawyers or police officers. They don't know the elements. They don't know what's relevant and what's not. They just know what makes them feel uncomfortable and what made them come to the police today. And they often can't even see all of the breadcrumbs that led up to that moment. And so that's our job, to be able to put as a prosecutor, we are still investigators as well. And we are supposed to continue the investigation. The officers, their job is to get the probable cause, which is a misconception. I feel like some younger prosecutors may have where, oh, if the police didn't put it together, then we don't have a case, And it's like, no, your job is to keep, continue investigating and ask further questions, find more evidence, find more witnesses as well. And so I always talk to my victims and I'm like, let's start from the beginning. How did you meet? And it's relevant because I can't tell you how many times in stalking cases, but even in DV cases, that like from the moment they utter the words of how they met, I'm like, oh, I see why they chose you. Or your type in a way, and not your type, but like somebody who has been through the experiences, you exposed vulnerabilities that they knew they could prey on and that they were sometimes taught to prey on generationally, And so I start from the beginning and I'm saying, hey, let's talk to me about, okay, I want to know what it was like when things were good, what attracted you to them, what was great, because I'm also looking for the Mr. Me Too's, some of the green red flags, and then I want to know when things changed. And sometimes the victims they can't always identify themselves, because they've never thought about it that way, And so you'll see sometimes they'll realize it for the first time when they're with you, when things changed. And sometimes we notice it first because we watch their demeanor change.
At what point in this disclosure are you asking questions that will help you understand if the victim had any other interactions that made them suspect that they were being followed that they haven't reported? Or are you looking for something else at this point?
Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's not just, okay, were they being followed? Because you have to look at your state stalking statute and they can be phrased, in a variety of ways. But generally, you're looking for a repeated course of conduct, right? And repeated course of conduct does not necessarily mean for a long time, right? There's case law, at least in Florida, that says a repeated course of conduct can occur within like 20 minutes, or half an hour or an hour, as long as there's continuous, it's intended to harass, and there's substantial emotional distress. Like there's an example of some people heckling a vendor in the mall, and coming around over and over and throwing stuff at him and that being stalking, It can happen in a day in terms of like, I know that sounds crazy, but until you see the phone records, it's real. Hundreds of text messages and hundreds of phone calls back to back to back to back to the point that the victim can't even pick up their phone or receive other phone calls, right? So all of those things can be, other forms of stalking as well. So what you're looking for is not always just micro corroboration of the patterns, which is super important, which we'll talk about more later. But it's also the intent, right? The mindset of the defendant, the mindset of your abuser. And you're looking for, I wrote the note, I talked about the distinguish the behavior and the mentality and like why it's dangerous, right? And where obsession turns into, the inability to accept rejection or like be without you. Like losing you is losing their world. And then that turns into, if I can't have you, no one can, which has the potential to turn into a murder-suicide situation. And the whole I will always love you turns into you will always be mine, right? And so sometimes that language is in text messages and it shows intent of purpose and the continuity of their behavior and the intent in that and why they continuously do that.
As you're talking, I'm thinking, famously, I know I said I didn't watch the whole series, but I did read some press on it. And I think even Penn Badgley had to come out and be very intentional about saying, Joe is a bad guy. And obviously the series makes it very clear going through, but because so many people, and still with the series progressing, there were some fans who were really kind of pushing aside the violent behavior and romanticizing Joe. And I feel like, we as prosecutors, we always worry about that in the jury box too, and in the community. And I'm wondering these strategies, you talked about a lot of these stalking behaviors. They're so common. They're so unnerving because, again, they're unwanted. But we know that outside, the community, the jury, the fact finder can minimize them. Oh, so he loved her. Oh, it's romantic. This is pursuit. As the prosecutor, how are you driving that wedge that day and night? If you say, I know you talked about it with the reports, but that understanding of this behavior, how are you exposing that?
Sometimes it depends, because sometimes when your victim is aware of it, you can expose it through them and through the narrative, right? The way that you craft your direct is super important. And, when younger prosecutors are trying stalking cases, because a lot of them don't go to trial, because if it's a good case, like in good cases, we're lucky enough to have enough evidence where it's like, this is really not in your best interest, But every now and then, what goes with a lot of the stalking and domestic violence abuser mentality is a lot of denial and also narcissism. And so you get people who have literally 83 pages of text messages, and I'm not talking about bubbles. I'm talking about the transcript that's in 8 font, 83 pages of that. And you still want to go to trial and say you weren't stalking this lady,
83 pages of 8-point font of text messages. That is not love. That is harassment.
100%. Exactly. So sometimes you can use your victim in the way that you craft your direct to pull out that information where they're showing the vindictiveness or how desperate they were. And it's in their demeanor. Sometimes it's in their words. Sometimes it's in their demeanor. Like when I was saying before, when I pre-try my victim and go through that timeline with them and I'm watching for that demeanor change, I want that same demeanor change on the stand, because I don't have to say it. The jury can see it. Like, I am going to say it and close, but because that's my substantial emotional distress. And you can see right where that line is. When we talk about the line of delineation or demarcation where the victim is like, hey, no, stop it, whether they say that verbally and explicitly or whether they say that through an injunction or through blocking the person or leave me alone or just not answering ever again, And then other times there are victims that they're not quite there 100% to see it because they're still a little caught up in the cycle and they're still a little caught up in the, well, maybe, and they want to believe the person's good intentions, because the reality is this: stalkers and domestic violence abusers, they're not 100% bad people, They are very manipulative, or they don't appear to be bad people and they do good things, and they can be good to other people, but not you. And so a lot of people get stuck in that mentality. And so sometimes what you want to do is when you have that victim on the stand, you want to elicit the information that you need. And then you really want to craft your closing to really put it all together. That's where visuals can come in handy. I love doing stalking timelines. I timelines. And because you can use them, they're necessary for you to understand, because many times the victims, they're like, oh, that was before this and that. And when you lay it all out, the stalking incidences and the in-between incidences, because here, stalking is really just a compilation of non-criminal acts that make a crime, right? Most of these incidences, not all, but most of the incidences of stalking on their own would not be an arrestable offense. But when you compile them all together, that is when you get, an actual crime. And it could be anywhere from, aggravated based off of a credible threat, to repeated violations of an injunction or use of a weapon. Whenever I do stalking trainings, I like to call it stalking and stalking-like behavior, because I'm like, let's talk about whenever you get a case that's charged as a stalking or an ag stalking or a pretrial release violation or an injunction violation or written threats. To me, you need to be thinking about all of those, because, or even harassing phone calls, it's what the statute we have in Florida, because it could be one or a combination of those things. It may come in as stalking and it's like, it's actually one injunction violation, but, the second violation we're not really going to be able to prove. Or it may come in as an injunction violation and you're like, no, this is ag stalking, Yeah.
I have so many questions wrapped up, but I guess the first question is, and you can pull from you, but you can also pull from any of your cases. What type of investigative tools exist? What type of things are you looking for when you're trying to determine what the perpetrator has done based on the report of the victim?
Right. So I am like an outside the box thinker. I love evidence-based prosecution. Even when, and like people will say, aren't all prosecutions evidence-based prosecutions? Yes, technically, yes, But, evidence-based prosecution is the term that we use when we don't have a victim that is cooperative or testifying, right? And I don't like the word cooperative, but they're not testifying.
Right, not participating, right.
Correct, not participating. But there are a lot of evidence-based prosecution techniques that you need to apply in your stalking cases. So I talk to my victims again with that timeline. I want to kind of figure out where you want to find that like line of delineation or demarcation, right? When the behavior turns into stalking and not just annoying in the relationship. And sometimes it's explicit and sometimes it's implied. And many times it's gray. Okay. Like when you talk about issues, many of the issues or defenses that will come up is, well, how did he know that this time you meant to enforce the injunction when all the other times you would let him stay? And then, you'd get the injunction, then you let him stay, and then he would leave, and then he would come back. And how do you know that this time was the time? Right. And just because that pattern has happened in the past doesn't mean that this time we can't prove it. Right. But we need to figure out what were the verbal cues, what were the written cues in text message, And a lot of times, sometimes things will look like coincidences. And so it's like, how is it not coincidences? So tools and things that I'm looking for are, I start with the victim's phone and their text messages, right? And sometimes I'm going back before the incident because I'm looking for the shifts in the pattern of communication, right? The shifts in what she was saying, how frequent, and I'm saying using she as the victim right now, how often she was responding, the nature of her response. I'm looking for intensity, and where the intensity is shifting in terms of like the victim kind of becoming calmer, like not calmer, but I guess more anxious or more just quieter and withdrawing more, and the offender becoming like their bubbles, increasing, on the other side and increasing in intensity as well, or becoming more demanding. And again, I'm looking for the intention. I'm looking for the motive, I'm also trying to figure out, again, micro corroboration. I want all of those small details because even just the smallest of details can, build up and be a part of your stalking. Again, it's the non-criminal things, the things that appear to be coincidences, that maybe were not, okay, your neighbor reported seeing him, driving by your house a couple days in a row. Then your tires get slashed. We may not be able to prove that he slashed your tires. Then you start getting text messages the next day that says, oh, so-and-so was at your house yesterday, huh? Okay, now I'm putting two and two together because neighbor said this, or you're over here accusing me of having another man over. How did you know I had another man over? I did because I can, because I'm not with you anymore. But how did you know that? Right? And that man was only over yesterday, So if that man is still in your life, I may add that man to the witness list, I want to list the manager or the receptionist, that is able to come in and say, hey, he would drive by and pop in even on days that she was off. You know what I mean?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And things of that sort.
In this case, in you, sometimes I guess I would say Hollywood can be accused of over dramatizing. I mean, again, in this first episode, there's scenes where he's a peeping Tom voyeur into her home, watching her with a partner, masturbating outside, public masturbation, and following her and breaking into her home at one point. Are these things that you've seen escalate in cases that you've handled? Did Hollywood get this right? Did it get anything wrong?
So again, we're not going to know about all of these things. We're not always going to know that he was lingering outside the home. We're not always going to know that he was masturbating outside the home and things of that sort, or the extent of the following. But sometimes we can, and that's frustrating. And sometimes we will know in our mind, like, how did you get that piece of information? How would you have known that? Right. And if you can find like 5 or 6 of those or 3 or however many, like multiple of those, instances, sometimes you can put it together and circumstantially say, how else would he have known these things? And sometimes there are incidents and issues that you can't prove. Like, for instance, a tracker was found on my car. Right. I'm not charging him with putting the tracker in the car if I can't prove it based on how the elements are written in my state, However, it is relevant that you did find a tracker on your car. And then when you found it, when you had it removed, right? And then how his behavior changed after that moment. And that's how you argue relevancy of it, right? It's because, Your Honor, we haven't charged him with it. However, the reality is it is still relevant to the stalking in terms of whether, his behavior, because before then he was like he would pop up in random places. I was at a restaurant. He would happen to be at the same restaurant too. I went to a bar. He happened to be at the same bar too. I was at the car wash. He happened to be there at the same time, which is not his usual time, right? Even schedules, and changes in schedules, especially when someone is very routine, can be helpful. And it's like, as soon as I found that tracker, all of a sudden that stopped. His behavior shifted and he became angry, more agitated. Now he's threatening me because he's lost his piece of information. Right. So now where he was more passively, being, a more elusive in the information, in the way that he was kind of harassing you or letting you know I'm watching you without or implying those types of things. Now he doesn't have that anymore. And all of a sudden, so it is relevant, and it's relevant to her state of mind, if nothing else, because substantial emotional distress is, at least in Florida, part of the, a necessary element and part of proving that stalking. So stalking cases are DV cases in general, but definitely stalking cases. You really learn the importance and the nuances of motions in limine, and your pretrial motions and the difference. I remember the first time that in Florida, we call it Williams rule, which is the prior bad acts, evidence in 404. And so, the first time I had a Williams rule training, it was called Williams rule, inextricably intertwined and relevant evidence. And it was the presenter, which is my old supervisor, he talked about the intersection and like the way that those kind of can be used on a spectrum effectively, And so is it Williams rule, or is it inextricably intertwined, or is it both? Or is it just relevant? Like, we don't need a Williams rule or an inextricably intertwined. It's relevant,
And I know this is going to seem, I don't mean to interrupt you, very in the weeds, but I feel like it's so important. And I just want to say, this is why I love you so much, because of course you preempted that question by going right into the how you're preparing for trial. So, I mean, everyone should be so lucky to have you on a case. But can you just, like I said, I know it might fill in the weeds, but real quickly, can you just sort of break it down into the impact, the difference between other acts, Williams, inextricably intertwined, which is part of the crime, and just relevant evidence? Just, in a way, because there's a lot of people listening, and I think it's so important.
Yeah. So the Williams rule, or the prior bad acts evidence, right? It really is actually, we always say prior bad acts, but it really is other crimes, or other bad acts, because it can be acts that occurred before the incident or subsequent to. For example, I had a case recently, or my attorneys had a case recently where the defendant commit a battery. He actually committed a series of batteries on her over a few days, because she was the breadwinner and she was like, you're not going to beat me, and I'm making all of the money and, supporting you fully. So I'm divorcing you. And of course, he gets upset about that. We all know that, when the victim decides to leave, that's the most dangerous and volatile, part of the relationship and time period for her. Right. And so she calls the police, presses charges, hauls herself over to Texas, and he's arrested, let out on bond because it's a misdemeanor battery. And then all of a sudden we get pretrial release violations and a calls from the victim saying, hey, he followed me all the way to Texas, where I had to get an injunction against him. And then he violated that injunction, and now they've got other charges against him there. And so when he's trying to say, I didn't do this, I didn't do that, no, to all the battery charges, or that's not the reason for the argument, and that's not this, we were able to use some of that evidence of what happened afterwards, to show, again, that intent, the continuity of purpose, and that same ongoing theme, And so your Williams rule is going to be other crimes and other acts. It could be physical abuse, or it could be verbal or emotional abuse as well. And Williams' rule, it's what many of us learned in law school as mimic, right? And that's an acronym for motive, intent, mistake, or absence thereof, a common scheme or plan, and also nature of the relationship, right? Nature of the relationship is, and first of all, what we all learned is mimic is not an exclusive list. Those are just common examples that, like, there's set case law on all of those. But there's also set case law on nature of the relationship as well. And that's where we use it a lot in domestic violence and in stalking cases, right? So sometimes it's the patterns of every time this happened or this conversation came up, he would react in this way. And that could be, getting verbally aggressive. That could be, hitting you. And it doesn't always be in the same manner. And it could be, starting to threaten you, or you're talking about triggers, right? And so that's super important to be able to bring in, because we can use it for any of those reasons that are in mimic, as well as the nature relationship, and really any other reason that we can articulate that is not just propensity. Okay. And so Williams' rule, at least in Florida and in many other states, requires a 10-day notice. You have to file a notice of intent to rely on other crimes, or other bad acts. And you have to just list them out briefly with the specificity of an information or indictment, which is really minimal. Just kind of list out that information and say, hey, I intend to talk about these things or not, in trial. And it's super important because the judge needs context too for the entire case as well. And, that Williams rule can be used, or the inextricably intertwined or relevant evidence motion can be used even if it is denied. I'm commonly, saying to the judge, okay, I hear that you found the victim credible, but you don't feel that there is enough to, pass the balancing test in terms of prejudice. However, I just want the defense and the court to understand that if the defense goes down this certain line of questioning or asks these specific questions, the victim's only truth and only response can be this. She should not be required to make up a new response or omit, the truth because it is too prejudicial. So if the defense is going to go down this road, I would, I do believe it's going to be opening the door. And many times the judge will say, I agree, or they'll give their opinion on that, or they'll say, we'll see when we get there, but you've planted the seed before time. That way, if you do get to that point, the judge is like, I didn't see where you were going in the Williams motion, but now that all the testimony came out, I do see where you're going, state and defense. You're right. They're right, And so it's so much more effective when you do it as a motion in limine, and even when you lose it, and then, so that you're bringing it back up in the middle of trial, as opposed to having this first conversation about it, sidebar, for the first time in the middle of trial, when the judge is like, I am not excusing this jury to go out and hash this all out. This should have been filed in advance. So that's super important. And then inextricably intertwined does not require a notice or any pre-filing. You can argue inextricably intertwined just right there, like during your motions in limine, right before a trial, whether that be the day of for misdemeanors many times, or like a week in advance and stuff for felonies. There's no notice requirement, but you definitely should put in your motions in limine to talk to the judge. And inextricably intertwined is saying that whether or not this is a prior bad act or whatever it may be, this fact and this conversation, this testimony is so integrated into the crime and into the fact pattern that we have to discuss to prove the crime here, that if we're not allowed to talk about it, it's going to really ruin the context. The jury will not understand. It will confuse the jury, and they will not get a full picture or understand the full context of this incident. And so it is literally inextricably intertwined. Sometimes something can be both. It can technically be Williams' rule, but the stronger argument is inextricably intertwined. And sometimes you're like, listen, this is not inextricably intertwined and it's not Williams' rule. Or you can call that if you want to. It could be both, but it's relevant, okay? Because it is part of the incident. It is the incident, It's not just inextricably intertwined. It's the evidence of the incident. you know?
It's like, and I'm so glad. I think in all of these episodes, I think you're the only guest that ever brought up. I mean, when we're thinking about pretrial motions, we're thinking about preparing and having rulings, before trial and what can come in, what's excludable. I think we're also always thinking about keeping our records strong for later appeals. And you even brought up the third reason of putting on notice for when the defense opens the door. And trials are long and winding, and a lot of information comes out. And during cross-examination of a victim, or if a defendant gets up on the stand and says something, or a defense witness, or cross-examination of one of our witnesses, the door can be open to admitting some of the evidence that a judge could have found inadmissible in the beginning. And now you've removed this lack of notice from the defense. And most importantly, we've moved towards justice because people can see what's going on. And obviously, I mean, Kristina, I really could talk to you all day. And you've already talked so much about how we've moved and gotten better. I know in conversations with you, you talked about the training you do in your office. How have we gotten better as prosecutors in handling stalking cases, and what more work do we have to do?
So we've gotten better because I think that we are paying attention to them more, right? The fact that we're having stalking trainings, there's a Stalking Awareness Month. I love that for Equitas, stalking is one of the specific named, crimes that you all focus on, right? And not just considering it as a subset of domestic violence, because it applies outside of the context of domestic violence as well. And those cases are most important, and they're misdemeanors, and they go to county court with the baby prosecutors and often get lost, if they don't understand the bigger picture yet, because they're very complex. And I see that we're starting to notice that more, respect that more, and educate ourselves more on it. Slight spoiler alert for you, because I did go past episode 1, Jo is not her only stalker. She has a best friend, quote unquote best friend, who also, believes that she knows better for her. And then as the episodes progress, you realize that her behavior is just as controlling, is just as damaging, is just as obsessive with Beck as Joe's is. And they are approaching it from different perspectives. I mean, different angles, but they're doing the same thing. They're causing the same outcome for her. And so stalking is important for so many reasons, or understanding stalking is important for so many reasons. Where we have areas to improve is just really not being afraid to think outside the box, and then take the time to listen to victims. Stalking cases are not easy. There's no cookie cutter, checklist for it. I have victims that have come in with a binder of information before. And I'm like, thank God for you, because you're like, y'all gonna call me crazy, but listen, this is happening, And when we try to be very mindful of using that word crazy with victims, because it's okay, if you think a victim can behave in a way that we think is not normal, and paranoid, but let's figure out, when you're saying crazy, what level of crazy, in what way? And then the question becomes, if they're paranoid, why are they paranoid? What caused that? Paranoia is a sign of it's an evidence of substantial emotional distress, right? So let's break that down. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, someone came by and slashed your tires, but we have no idea who. Okay, should she live in a house or an apartment? Either way, I want to know about surveillance. I want to know if there's a gate in the apartment complex. I want to know, nowadays, people have Ring cameras even on their apartment door fronts, Okay, she doesn't have a Ring camera. That's fine. What about her neighbors whose cameras actually point towards her house? She doesn't have to go out there and knock on their door and ask. Just tell me which houses what the numbers of the houses that have cameras, and I'll send my officer or investigator out there. I'll make the phone calls and ask them if they could preserve their Ring camera from these dates and see if they have any evidence of it. It's looking into, sometimes I get frustrated because I look at the violent crime, unit cases, and I'm like, you guys have tire prints and shoe prints and things that I thought were CSI Miami, and you actually you collected that. right? So I want to know in my DV case, how do I get those? You know, and so things like where I say tire prints and shoe prints, for us, they're going to be things like phone dumps. Did you take the defendant's phone? And educating our officers, hey, if this is like a phone based or computer based stalking, like get the search warrant, and then so you can get the dump, because the dumps tell everything. Oh my gosh, we could do a whole different thing on dumps another day.
We really could, and especially because we know, I mean, from the beginning of what he did with his own computer to look at her up and what he did when he got in her apartment and what he did when he took her phone. It is, yeah, that'll be the second episode. You, the digital.
I know,
the
right?
digital
Exactly.
breadcrumbs.
Literally, let's do that.
I mean, Kristina, this conversation was pure gold because you demonstrated everything from, understanding offender behavior, understanding that the violence, can be embedded in these acts that look like they are not that extreme at all, that they're not going anywhere. You've talked to us about complex legal issues and then general good trial advocacy, and then just talking about investigation and all the different ways and pieces to pull in all of the evidence and then present it in a way that the fact finder understands. So this is incredible. And I do want to invite you back. So get ready for that email. But before I let you go, I have some quick questions that I like to ask all the guests. They're very rapid fire, if you're up for it. Okay, so we talked about a TV series, and I'm going to ask you if a TV series or movie were to be made about your work as a prosecutor, what detail would you insist that they get right?
My facial expressions.
Okay, wait, now you have to expound on that a little bit.
Okay. I don't have any control of my facial expressions. I try really hard, but I don't know. I just can't, by the time I realize you're probably making a face, it's too late. I'm expressive. And so many times, and I like using that even in trial. I use my hands, I use my facial expressions. Object to my face, please do.
All right, we're going to remember that because they really need to make a movie about you because you're just doing amazing work. Okay, second question. What is one thing that Hollywood never shows about stalking cases that you wish people understood?
The control, the obsessiveness. The fact that, because there's a lot of victim blaming of, well, why don't they just block him? I tell stalking victims all the time, I understand why you don't block them. You need to know where their head is at, because you need to know when they're in some psychotic, manic state where you're like, you know what, maybe I shouldn't be somewhere predictable right now, or maybe I need to call the police. But if you block them, you have no idea. And that's how you end up with people who you're just sitting there at work like a sitting duck. And then this person comes up, literally, water bottle of gasoline, lights you on fire at your job, So it's the devil, And so I wish that people could see the mentality, the thought process, in terms of and how, when we talk about narcissism too, how Joe feels that he is so well-intended. When we talk about malice and maliciousness, that's when they're no, when they say, I was trying to, he means it. He really thought that, because even he can't see it. So that's what I wish we could see.
And last but not least, why does this work matter to you personally?
I just like being able to fight for the underdogs or the underrepresented, the undervalued. And SVU cases, the DV, the sexual assault, the human trafficking, all the abuse cases, those victims are often undervalued, overlooked, gaslighted. And their voices matter. And, when we talk about it in the bigger picture of domestic violence and even stalking violence and domestic violence and all of these special victims crimes, they are the birthplace of community violence. That's where it starts. And so I'm all about what is the most effective way to make change? And if it starts in the home, then that's where we focus. And so that's where my focus is.
It's just been amazing sitting and listening to you, just all the passion that you bring to the issue, the thoughtfulness, the expertise, and your willingness to share it with the field, with your offices, with the greater field, and now during this podcast. So thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. And for everyone else listening, make sure you join us next week on Just Champions, when we will be digging into the HBO series I May Destroy You and exploring alcohol-facilitated sexual assault, consent, and what accountability really looks like. And follow Just Champions wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss it. This podcast discusses the violent crimes of sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking, and human trafficking. If you need support, please check the show notes for links to hotlines and agencies that can help. For more information about Equitas, please go to equitasresource.org. That's AEQUITAS resource.org, or follow us at Equitas_resource on Instagram. This series is executive produced by Jennifer Long, Equitas, and Robin Hopkins. This series is sound designed and edited by Dan Kroll. This season of Just Champions is funded by a generous grant from the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women, supporting efforts to improve justice in cases of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women.